Hello, this is another recording in the series of Druid ramblings. As you can see, we're back in the kitchen because I'm baking cakes, sultana cake for the students. It's the last day of lectures tomorrow, so thought I'd give them all food poisoning. For tonight's meander, one of the main issues I want to look at is developing ideas around a modern Druid ethic, a modern Druid kind of moral outlook, which could apply across the board to a number of different relationships and sort of ways of structuring society and so on. These ideas are partly inspired by some of the philosophies that started with, well, arguably started with Nietzsche. You could argue people before then had not wholly dissimilar ideas, but certainly Nietzsche drove them forward in a much grander way. And then we'll bring in some ideas from various other people as we go along. The reason for starting with Nietzsche is that he argued back in the day that there were two major ways of looking at the world, two major ways of understanding it, kind of moral viewpoints, if you like. The master mentality and the slave mentality, which he said had developed over the course of many, many, many centuries, if not indeed thousands of years, and reflected in different moral viewpoints. The slave mentality, which he was not favourable towards, he particularly associated with Christianity. Did have a little bit of a bee in his bonnet about that. The master mentality he didn't think was perfect by any stretch of the imagination, but he was a bit more sympathetic towards that. And obviously it did get very taken up by his sister Elizabeth, who was completely balmy. And she fell madly in love with the whole National Socialist Nazi movement in a way that her brother never did. But because of her, some of his ideas came to have huge influence on Nazism, which is yet another sort of stick to beat pagans with, unfortunately, in some quarters, but we'll put that to one side for the moment. The master mentality that he espoused, he very much associated with the sorts of ideas you can see in a lot of old mythological cycles. The hero tales of ancient Greece, Achilles and Patroclus and Heracles and so forth. And characters like Siegfried from the Germanic and Scandinavian cycles of mythology. These big, huge, bold figures, usually warriors most of the time, striding about the world, battling forces of evil and seizing kingdoms, and it's all very sort of dramatic and epic and dynamic. For him, that sort of master mentality, echoing back to the days of the warrior kings of the ancient world, reflects pride and self-worth and independence and striving forward and asserting yourself and being strong and forceful and vigorous. It's certainly, I suppose you could say, a fairly macho sort of morality, but he also saw, as indeed you can easily find female characters in the ancient myths who embody those same sorts of qualities, who have that sort of Amazonian dynamism about them in terms of how they approach the world. For him, that was the sort of, if you like, the advocacy of the strong. That if you were strong, you were forceful, you could seize the world, you could shape it to your will, and you defined your own moral standards as the sort of dominant force in society. At a social level, it also very much ties up with ideas that you can find in not only National Socialism, obviously that kind of master race fanaticism, but a lot of sort of self-empowerment, self-confidence movements of the 1970s, 80s through into the modern era, of sort of empowering yourself and striding forward into life. It's a lot of business ethics, sort of books written around business ethics, make a great show of there we go, right. Just measure out the sugar, great show of promoting those sorts of values. And they're not wholly bad by any stretch of the imagination. It's sort of, if you like, the morality of the entrepreneur, of the person who drives society forward. Without those sorts of forceful characters, very little will get done in the world. So it's not an entirely bad thing by any stretch of the imagination. What do you like? A spoon. But it's certainly not a morality or an outlook that has much time for the weak, the vulnerable, those who are struggling. It's very much a morality for the strong. That you take what you want, you seize what you want, but it also ties up, as well as with some rather dodgy modern political movements, you can see a tie into the aristocracy and that whole land-grabbing mentality, especially of the early aristocrats. Bearing in mind that a lot of the somewhat romanticised views of the aristocracy we have these days, the kind of whole Downton Abbey sort of thing, of these people who are stewards of their manor and so on, which is not to decry that any of them aren't, and that there aren't many perfectly nice and pleasant people within the aristocracy. But it's worth bearing in mind that if you go back far enough in their ancestry, you get to the days of the robber barons, people who became extremely rich and wealthy and powerful, largely because they stormed into an area of land, said, "This is mine," and then killed anyone who disagreed with them. For Nietzsche, that was just the, if you like, the law of the jungle, the way of the world. It's a bit ruthless, a little bit grim, obviously, if you get to be one of the people getting killed for standing up and saying, "I don't think that land is yours." But in that sort of law of the jungle mentality, the robber barons of the ancient world, or the city dynamos of this day and age who go in and asset strip companies and all that sort of business, were simply exerting their influence, their might, as the heroic, dominant master characters within the sort of ideology that Nietzsche was explaining and understanding. The converse, the slave morality, is one which reacts against the masters and tends to see the masters as embodiments of wickedness, of extreme selfishness, of brutality, of greed and corruption, all of which is perfectly understandable if you happen to be some 5th century farmer who was happily toiling their land until some upper-class yobbo stormed in and told you it was now their land, and then promptly started charging you rent for living on your own land and threatened to kill you if you didn't pay out. Understandable why people get a bit fed up with that. He said the slave mentality, the slave morality, reacts against the master mentality and tends to value the things that the master mentality rejects and derides. So compassion for the weak, for the vulnerable, kindness towards them, gentility, and particularly a bugbear of Nietzsche's was humility. One of the chief reasons why it was a bugbear for him is because, of course, it's one of the most vaunted virtues within Christianity, the idea of being gentle Jesus, meek and mild, as the lyrics of the hymn go, which he saw in a rather hostile light. His feeling was to some extent that Christianity had started as a slave religion. If you go back to its very earliest roots, a lot of the appeal was to the outcast, the lepers, the tax collectors, the prostitutes, the downtrodden of society. And as it expanded into Roman territories and beyond, it became a religion very popular with slaves in Rome and Greece and so forth, giving them hope and optimism and all the sorts of things that the religions of their owners, their masters, probably, if we are being honest, as modern day pagans, really didn't give them an awful lot to look forward to, really. Whereas Christianity did. It appealed to those on the bottom rung of society. Of course, as Christianity took off through the empire and it started to reach the upper crust, missionaries were going into areas and targeting the aristocrats, the royalty, the lords and ladies, convert them, and then assume that their tenants, their peasants, their serfs would de facto follow in the conversion. It shifted from being a full-on slave religion, a religion of the oppressed and downtrodden, to becoming a religion of the, if it's such a word, the downtreaders, those who do the oppressing, the royals, the autocrats, the aristocrats, the tyrants. Characters like the Emperor Theodosius, for example, by no stretch of the imagination could he be said to espouse a slave morality. Very much a master morality if you look at his writings and the various laws he passed and so forth. A man with virtually no compassion about him. So one of Nietzsche's complaints is that when Christianity became dominated by the master class, they started to use the preaching in the sermons to promote the values of slave mentality to the people on the pews, to the followers. Not because the bishops and the cardinals and the high-ranking, high-born people particularly believed any of it, but as an expedient means of keeping the peasantry in control. And that really is, I think, a lot of Nietzsche's complaint, was that slave morality was used to keep people enslaved, to keep them gentle and meek and mild and turning the other cheek and not rebelling, not making a fuss, not seeking self-empowerment, not trying to become members of the master race, as it were, or master class, whatever you want to call them, themselves, which is why he balked against it. Now, for Nietzsche, both the master mentality and the slave mentality each have their virtues, each have their problems, their challenges, their limitations, their weaknesses. He didn't think much in terms of a third option. A chap called Lester Hunt, a modern-day philosopher, has argued that there ought to be a third option. We should think about a third option, and he does make a suggestion, which I'll go over in a moment. It's worth thinking about that in considerable depth. From a polytheist stance, if you get trapped in dualism, either or, it's this or it's that, it's light or dark, black or white, summer or winter, these dualisms, master or slave, then I think that's when we have to have warning signals, as it were, go up, that we are perhaps not paying attention to the fact that there might be a third, a fourth, a fifth, a sixth option. There may be more ways than just this kind of very limited dualistic mentality that presents itself. We need to think outside of that box and consider what the other options are. Now, what Hunt suggests is not so much his own idea, although he greatly expands on somebody else's idea and adds a lot to it. He suggests the idea of a lady called Jane Jacobs, who was writing about the sort of ethics of business and economics and so forth back in the middle and latter part of the 20th century. She suggested a dualism of her own, of which only one part, Lester Hunt argues, is pertinent, because he says it serves as a third option. So rather than master or slave, it gives a third option entirely that doesn't fit into that dualism. The idea that Jane Jacobs described was what she termed the trade approach, the trade mentality. And bearing in mind she was talking about business and economics, so she wasn't going on about morality in any grand, far-reaching sense. This is her idea that he has taken and transposed into a wider context. And I think it's a worthwhile idea to transpose into a wider context. The trade mentality, he says, is neither master nor slave, but something else entirely. A master comes in and takes. a slave has it taken from them. There is no issue of consent in the master or slave relationship. The master offers something to the slave, protection from other dominant characters who may be even more bullying and more unpleasant than he or she is. And the slave may get something out of that. They may get sort of a degree of protection and some security and so forth. So there's a bit of a give and a bit of a take in it. But there's no real sense in which the master asks the slave. They just take it, and the slave puts up with it. So the rich take the sources of wealth. They take the sources, if you want to be Marxist about it, the sources of production. They establish that role, that dominance for themselves. And other people go along with it, or don't, as the case may be. And when they don't, they usually get killed. That's the nature of that dynamic. Trade, he says, is about establishing consent. So I've made a cake, and you like cake, and you have just made an apple pie, and I like apple pie. So you offer to trade an apple pie for a cake. For that to work, Jane Jacobs points out, in any economic sense, is that trade has to be voluntary. I've got to want to swap my cake for your apple pie and vice versa. If you nick my cake and then just dump an apple pie in my lap, regardless of whether I want it or not, that's not trade. That's stealing and leaving your apple pie as you go. Trade has got to involve consent and therefore discussion. I've got to say, well, I've got this, and you've got to say, oh, well, that's nice, I've got such and such a thing. We talk, we debate, we discuss, we exchange. Therefore, it's fairer. Something that Hunt also goes on to add, which is quite an interesting one, is that the tradesman or tradeswoman has the moral virtue, the particular value that they aspire to, not the compassion of the slave, nor the sort of forcefulness, if we can put it like that. I'm trying to avoid saying arrogance, even though certainly if you look at the writings of Ayn Rand, they drip with arrogance, but I'm trying to avoid saying that. The forcefulness of the master mentality, rather the defining virtue, he argues, of the trade mentality is self-respect and independence, that the tradesman or tradeswoman works for a living. They do not expect such a thing as a free lunch. So the master mentality says, right, you've got a horse, right, I'm taking your horse, and if you object, I'll smash your face in. There's no sense of working to attain the horse or to acquire the horse, or wanting the consent of the horse breeder or whoever. It's just, I've seen something, I want it, I'm taking it. So it's not a mentality and approach either to economics or indeed to, well, much of anything, if we're being honest, to any kind of moral relationship. It's one of seizure and constraint rather than one of agreement, consent and equality. The slave works hard but expects nothing in exchange, and I suspect you could, without wishing to offend too many religions, look at a number of religious teachings in which the idea of giving without any expectation of anything in return is seen as a central virtue. That's not 25. In the notion that you should expect something in return is often somewhat looked down upon as being grabby or greedy or needy or what have you. I'd like to suggest that this is the idea of trade. Obviously is nothing new. People have been trading since the Stone Age, possibly even earlier than that. But it is a virtue that is, as a moral virtue rather than as purely a business economic issue, is something that dates back to pagan times. So whilst Nietzsche might have characterized the pagan world when he was thinking about with the great hero cults, thinking of these great Greek and Roman and Scandinavian and what have you, sort of warrior lords and so forth. I think that's a rather rose-tinted spectacle view of those people. It's a very one-sided view of those people. These were nations which built heavily on trade rather than warfare, out-and-out warfare and exploitation. And obviously they did have lots of wars, but trade was one of their key defining characteristics, as it has been for pretty much all of humanity. And the notion that if you wish to receive something, you should in exchange give something. That, as a moral virtue, a moral standard, permeates all of the ancient cultures of the world that I can think of off the top of my head. And most of those forms of paganism that operate in the world today that base themselves on the traditions and inspirations and ideas of ancient cultures, including the Druid religion. So the notion is that you don't get something for nothing. Someone gives you something, it's only right, moral, just, proper to give something in exchange. These days you also have a lot of the idea of passing it on down the line, so that if the person who's given to you doesn't want anything particular in exchange, you can nonetheless express your gratitude by saying, oh, I'll donate some money to your favourite charity, or I'll help out, you name someone and I'll go and help them out in exchange for your having helped me out. So there's a kind of passing it on. But nonetheless, whether it's paid back directly or it's paid back indirectly by passing it on down the line, there is still this idea of balance, of exchange, of getting and giving, of not being totally a getter, which is, if you like, the master mentality, or totally a giver, the slave mentality, but someone who is at the balanced point where they both get and give fairly in exchange, and that what you give has to be something that the other person wants. So back to this trade issue. I can't force my cake upon you if you don't want cake. That's not trade. That's unfair. It's got to be some. If we strike a trade, we strike a barter. It's got to be for something that you want. And something that I want. So there's got to be a sort of fair, consenting, willing exchange in which we acknowledge each other's autonomy, each other's wishes, likes, dislikes, and so forth. And we get a sense that my cake is roughly equivalent in value to your apple pie. I do have a very cake-related mentality, don't I? That's a bit disturbing. Never mind. There's got to be some sense of equivalence. However we work that out, and the ins and outs of that are perhaps a topic that could fill a book quite easily. Hunt suggests that this is the third way forward, the third option, the alternative to being either master or slave, to be an independent trader. And I think there's an awful lot to say for that. I don't really like the word trader, to be honest. It smacks too much of business economics and ethics. I think it needs a more generalised term, but I'm not quite sure what. But someone who enters into relationships with others where we seek to appreciate what they want, seek to make them clear of what we want, and then seek a fair, balanced, and willing trade. And that our relationships are characterised by those issues of respect, mutual awareness, and mutual consent. So that we are both independent, both at the start of that trade act and at the end of it, and we walk away from one another. Coming at it from a Druid angle, like an awful, not every single Druid is an animist, but an awful lot are. I certainly come from that approach where animism and polytheism for me are just variations of a theme, the only real difference being the size of the spirits in question. So I want to suggest that from that point of view, the act of trade and negotiation is not just with other human beings, it's something that goes on with all sorts of beings, with other forms of animals, cats and dogs and horses and gerbils and whatever else we might want to trade with plant life. when we're planting crops, or we're planting flowers, or we're planting trees, orchards, whatever it is, or even just walking amongst wild plants and flowers and trees, that we are engaging with those life forms. As animists, we may well think in terms of rocks and rivers and such like things as also being animated. As a polytheist, I can also think in terms of deities and spirits that are not entirely related to a physical manifestation, but have a much broader existence. And that the act of trade is something that goes on between all of those types of beings. So not just humans instigating trades, but animals, plants, rocks, rivers, deities, what have you. They can trade with each other, they can trade with me, I can trade with them. We meet on mutual terms. So if we're thinking of a slightly silly example with my two dogs, we come to relationships that, I give them walks and cuddles and hugs and food and water, and in exchange they shed hair all over the place and fart a lot. So there is a trade of some description going on there. I'm not quite sure what it is, but I gain from their presence, their affection, their warmth, their love, and the exercise does get me out of the house and helps to burn off a few calories from the vast quantities of cake I consume. Any kind of a relationship is one of give and exchange, and if we factor in this animist element, that it is not just human beings that are thinking, not just human beings that have agency or rationality, that other beings do as well, then we can, in some shape, form, or guise, negotiate with those other beings, respect their autonomy, not storm in and take everything, which you could argue has been the human attitude to pretty much anything it comes across for a very long time now. That we just stomp in, take land, chop down forests, hunt, shoot, fish, kill everything in sight, take, and give very little back. Nor do we have to develop a sort of servile mentality in which we give and we give and we give and wear ourselves out in the process, like slaves working themselves to death. We need one of mutual respect, mutual independence with the world around us. Both the seen and the unseen worlds around us, and exploring that, coming up with a slightly more poetic term than trader, answers on the postcard for that one, would help to establish a more engaging and, I would argue, contented life, both for us in terms of how we experience the world, but also I think in terms of the other beings we share the world with, that we would stop maltreating them and they would gain a better deal from humanity taking that sort of autonomous, respectful trade relationship rather than either the master or the slave mentality. But I think that's probably more than enough waffling for now, so I've got to sit and work out when to take this cake out of the oven. And if anyone's got any questions or suggestions for future meanderings around given subjects, do shout, and I'll try and squeeze something in. Okay, thank you.